All right, everybody, welcome back. This is The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and today we are talking about Karen Tei Yamashita's novel, Through the Arc of the Rainforest, which is a book I've been teaching for the last couple years. Really fun, experimental, comedic, and yet doom-tuned work of fiction. But before we get into that, we've got the Trump-Harris debate coming tomorrow. Yeah, we'll be releasing on the day this episode releases will be the day of the debate, and we'll be covering that debate next week. So if you want to get in on that coverage, I would encourage you to subscribe to the podcast. And
we'll be a full week behind, but we'll get to see the fallout too, which is sometimes fun.
Yeah, and hopefully our reaction will be we'll be able to calibrate how depressed we are based on.
Well, maybe Trump's lack of mental competency will drive him out of the race. I'll have to rally behind Vance,
Yeah, I don't know.
Who suddenly starts like selling out arenas in Atlanta, Georgia for some reason. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of optimism about either of those potentialities. I mean, I don't think.
I think it's somehow. Let's make a prediction right now, since we haven't seen it, since it is tomorrow, and we can see how wrong we are. Mine is that somehow it gets even worse for Harris. Actually, is how I think it's going to go.
Yeah, I think Trump will be incoherent and insane, but that has never stopped anyone from voting for him before. Will he mention Hannibal Lecter? I think yes, the chances are high. I think
we've reached the point for sure where somehow it's more likely in this debate that we hear mention of Hannibal Lecter than the Hannibal Directive. And I think it's not even close.
No, touche. Yeah, I think the real thing that's been happening, and this often happens with Democratic nominees, is that, Harris has been tacking to the right in a misguided effort to appeal to conservatives, and in the process alienating large swathes of the base. And I, for one, am pretty tired of seeing blue-pilled losers retweeting stuff about Dick Cheney into my timeline.
What is this? Are they serious? Do they think that helps anything?
I'm old enough to remember what Dick Cheney was like when he was in power as the vice president under Bush, and it was a nightmare. It was arguably worse than even Trump. I mean, the number of heinous racist laws that were enacted towards the Muslim American community, the number of insane prosecutions that are built on nothing.
Patriot Acts, to say nothing of illegal wars and millions dead.
Yeah, I mean, forget about it. And
did you see Bernie, though?
What did he say? No.
Oh, Bernie was on one of these talk shows or one of these doing the interview, one of these stupid MSNBC or CNN or whatever it is. And he, made sure to be clear that while he and Dick Cheney agree on nothing, and he means nothing, no issue, there is one thing, and it's that we believe in the foundation of this country as a democratic one.
Oh, good.
And it's
good.
Whoa, Bernie, man.
What are we doing here?
What are we doing? You're doing that? You're doing that?
Call it off, right? I mean, we got to call it off.
It's
what was the 9/11 conspiracy thing? We got to pull it, right?
Right. It is. You can't, as someone who's been frustrated by the constant attack right of the Democratic Party for my entire lifetime.
Yeah,
it's just to the point of pure farce, right? That they're trotting out Dick Cheney as a sign of something good happening.
Yeah, it's inexcusable, but Well, we'll have more of this talk in next week's episode.
I mean, I'm hoping Harris is like, I'm proud to have the endorsement of Dick Cheney. It seems like she's gonna get there.
Yeah, that'll hit. That'll hit pretty hard.
Yeah. But let's talk about more good news before we get into the.
Oh, that's right. So the novel we're talking about today is set in Brazil, and we thought it'd be appropriate to cover a story from Salon that came out about a week ago on the 3rd of September, which tells us helpfully that temperatures in the Brazilian rainforest have never been higher.
No.
And believe it or not, this is not good for the continuity.
It's less than ideal. Yeah.
Continuity of the rainforest, which is, after all, the largest natural carbon sink in the world, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there's more trees per, more carbon is sucked up by those the rainforest than any other part of the globe. And wildfires have been running rampant because of the heat, because of the lack of moisture, and all indications are it is, quote unquote, the new abnormal.
I like that. Well, it's also, what does it say here? There were widespread reports of people coughing and gagging on smoke, shortness of breath, suffering from eye pain. It really is taking on the feeling of a dystopian novel, right? I mean, we really are sort of breaking through.
Dr. Michael Mann, a professor of Earth and Environmental Science at University of Pennsylvania, told Salon, and it will only get worse and worse as long as we continue to burn fossil fuels and generate carbon pollution. And since there's absolutely zero indication from either side that we're, right, at least in the United States, that we're going to make any meaningful inroads in that area, I feel like this article will essentially just be trotted out at the end of each summer for the next.
Well, you can't. I mean, that's true. It is trotted out because that's the thing about the rainforest, right? Like, we were reading this book and I thought, I wonder if anything's going on with the rainforest. And I feel like you could have typed in rainforest into Google anytime in the last 20 years, and you get an article very similar to this to say something like hotter than ever, worse than ever. I mean, the rainforest has had a really bad run. Like, you remember when you were a kid?
Oh, yeah.
You're old enough to be like when we were still trying to save acres of it.
Oh yeah. And the whales, right? I remember that.
The whales.
The whales, the rainforest.
But the rainforest, just like, we're done. Like, saving it isn't really part of the conversation anymore, is it?
No, it's like minimizing how much of it is like slash and burned for like, right, cattle farms. Like, under Bolsonaro, they were just, slashing as much of it as possible in order to create more, beef, because the beef industry is really big in Brazil, and cows need pasture land, not jungle. So
ideally,
I think it's slowed under Lula, but there gets to be a point when it's like, the point of no return, so to speak. And
right, and the rainforest is one of those interesting yet tragic elements of the environment, right? That the issue has been around for so long that you can track sort of the overall degradation of the ecosystem.
I mean, you can look at satellite photos and just see it like receding over the last 50 years.
We in fact choose to not save it. That was the end.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's also one of those things, and this kind of comes up in the novel a little bit, but it's one of those weird things where Americans being like, guys, Brazil, hey, it's America. Your natural resources, you're destroying them, and and so the Brazilian response is like, okay, but like, who the F are you to like how are the,
you have no standing.
How are the buffalo herds doing in the middle of I mean, just like, and America is a country that for centuries has benefited from more rapid industrialization, or for more than a century. And so when America comes to developing countries and is like, guys, Yeah, we're going to need you to not do exactly what we did as far as
Right.
fossil fuels. And so, with China, this happens too.
Which is one of the arguments that underpins the sort of like conservative anti-climate legislation, which is that like China and India aren't cutting their carbon emissions, so why should we, basically, right?
That's right. And I mean, what can you even say? It's like, all right, so we'll all just die together.
Yeah,
Like,
we'll just keep searching on Google once every 6 months and seeing that it's even hotter this time. It's never been hotter, in fact, Stu. I don't know if you knew that.
this is the hottest year. Basically, every month of every summer is now the hottest month of all time.
Every day. I like the idea that every day forever becomes hotter than the day before, just for eternity.
Yeah, it's not good. It's an escalation.
It's the new abnormal. That's right.
Yeah, so let's talk about this novel. This novel came out in, I believe, 1989. So it's quite ahead of its time in a certain number of ways. It is Through the Arc of the Rainforest. It's written by Karen Tei Yamashita. Yamashita is a Japanese-American writer who teaches in the UC system. I'm forgetting exactly which UC, but she's still alive. She's still working. She's written several other acclaimed novels. This is her first novel, I believe, and it's not that well known. We're going to be getting into some spoilers in our discussion of this, but I still think, even knowing what happens in the plot, the real joy of this book is the style and the way that everything unfolds. It's a very funny book, and I'm not going to be able to.
And there's not much suspense either.
Yeah.
Through the chapters, it's pretty pointed the way the story just gets laid out. It's almost like a weird form of spectacularly well written reportage by the ball, which we'll explain.
Yeah. It's a work of magical realism, the genre that emerged from a couple sources. I would say Kafka is an important antecedent, along with Jorge Borges, the short story writer, poet, literary critic. But it really kind of comes to its zenith in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Its apogee probably being the work of Nobel laureate Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Right.
100 Years of Solitude, Love in the Time of Cholera. Did you ever read any Garcia Marquez, Michael?
Yeah, 100 years.
Yeah, I read it in high school, which was quite a long time ago at this point, now that I'm 100 years old. But it is a kind of, I would say in some ways, the characteristic genre of postmodernism, in as much as it's realistic, right? I mean, it depicts a world that is not totally unlike our world, but suffused through these worlds are these kind of magical elements that, for the most part, go unremarked upon. Like, if we, in our day-to-day life, were to walk down the street and see a man who was 12 feet tall, we would freak out, and it would be the most insane thing that had ever happened, and there would be news stories about it around the world. Whereas in a magical realist world, it would just be kind of like people would notice it and then just carry on with their day, right?
Yep.
I think one story that I think of is this story by Marquez. The title is eluding me at the moment, but basically it's about a village, and one day this gigantic body just washes up on the beach, and it's a dead guy who is like 20 feet tall or so. He's a giant, essentially. And the villagers are kind of surprised by this, and the story just sort of revolves around the way they drag the body into the town. They're like thinking about it. It's just like these out of the ordinary events happen and are met with kind of a shrug rather than a
right, or met with normalcy to sort of appeal to the abnormal thing that's being discussed or described.
Speaking of the new abnormal, right? It's a sort of appropriate term. Now, Yamashita is Japanese American, as I mentioned, and she spent several years as a teacher working in Brazil. So during that time, she became very familiar with not only magical realist traditions, but also Brazilian culture. And this novel represents a kind of three-way fusion of several of her interests, including Japanese emigre populations. I think referred to as the Nikkei. They're people that leave Japan. The biggest Japanese population outside of Japan actually is in Brazil.
Really?
Yeah, which is something that you wouldn't know if you.
No.
I had a student a couple semesters ago who was Brazilian, and during Thanksgiving break, he went home for, for the holiday. And when he came back, when he was in Sao Paulo, he visited Japantown in Sao Paulo, where there are like a bunch of traditionally constructed Japanese houses and shrines and things like this that are just in the middle of this gigantic South American metropolitan city. It's actually like an interesting thing. Part of the reason Japanese population in Brazil went up so high is because of Asian exclusion acts that were enacted in the United States. So emigres that wanted to come to America were shut out because of racism in the early 20th century, and instead they went to Brazil and actually initially worked on kind of small farms and as sort of day laborers even. But because of close community ties, they eventually earned enough income to purchase the farms, and in many cases, Japanese Brazilians are quite successful and quite wealthy and quite integrated into the society. Although there's an interesting flow of the Japanese diaspora from Brazil back to Japan, and there's an exchange of people. It's quite interesting culture that before encountering this novel, I was completely unaware of. You've never been to Brazil, have you, Michael?
Never been to Brazil. No.
Nor have I. One of my best friends in high school was a Brazilian who came to boarding school. Actually went on to Dartmouth and is now a professor at Harvard, a very successful guy, Bruno. And so I got a little flavor of Brazilian culture at that time. He would come home to my house during Thanksgiving break and stuff because it was, not feasible to fly all the way back.
Right.
Which is where my love of all the 90s Brazilian soccer stars, which I've...
Oh, I was wondering.
Where I bored you to death by being like, we'll be watching a contemporary game and I'll be like, you remember Dunga, Michael? Michael's like, yeah, I remember Dunga. Like, oh, shut up. Like, what are you talking about? Remember Edmundo?
Yeah, it's like, how do you remember Dunga?
Like, I'm not nowhere near the football fan you are, but I did have this important influence at a young age that has marked me. Right. So the novel is... kind of patterned after the novela structure, which is the equivalent of the Spanish telenovela or the American or British soap opera, right? Mm. Which is to say there's a lot of intersections of characters, a lot of sort of unlikely coincidences that motivate.
Right, very tight story.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole novel is like very tightly plotted, very brilliantly interwoven, everything structurally, and it's very short. I think it's less than 200 pages, and yet crammed full of detail. The essential thing in the novel that motivates everything is the discovery of this mysterious substance deep in the rainforests of remote Brazil called the Matacao substance. And this farmer, Mane Peña, is digging one day and he's like hitting with his spade and he hits something hard. This? And the government comes in, they clear off the topsoil, and there's just this vast plain of this mysterious black substance that is very hard, seems to have magnetic qualities, right? Iron is attracted to it. And initially there's kind of nothing to be done about it. No one knows what to make of it. There's one chapter where they go through all the various theories about, what people believe it to be. It's like 20% think it's the CIA did this, 15% think it's aliens, 13% think it's a new natural, mineral or something. It's like there's no hard and fast answer to what this is, at least initially. But it's wondrous. It has, as we come to learn, many useful properties. It's almost miraculous. It can, once they figure out how to kind of harvest it, they realize that it has incredible, almost metamorphic qualities where it can be used to make artificial.
Right, like beyond plastic.
Yeah, it's like a magic plastic.
It's like a magic plastic.
It is like a plastic, but you can use it to make flowers that are more realistic than real flowers. You can use it to make food. People can eat it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like almost like the clay that would make a magical realism world.
Exactly. I mean, it is the chief, though not the only, magical realistic element of the story. And the novel revolves around the fact that once this substance is discovered in the middle of the remotest part of the jungle, naturally there is a rush from several angles to exploit it, right?
Yeah.
And I think the best way into the novel is probably to talk about the main characters. We've got.
Well, let's start with the first use of the realism.
All right, so the protagonist of the story is Kazumasa, who's Japanese, born in Japan. And when he's a child, he's involved in some kind of mysterious accident on a beach, the result of which is he has a plastic ball, or a ball of this black substance, which eventually we learn is identical with the substance in the rainforest, that floats right in front of his face a few inches out and spins in its own, it like rotates like a planet. It doesn't circle around his head, which sometimes it seems
sort of plays along with him in a sense.
Yeah, it sort of like floats. It isn't attached to him by any obvious mechanism. It's just floating there. And as in the case of many magical realist stories, this is just accepted. He becomes known as, the kid with the ball. And when he grows up, it's, the man with the ball, right? And people don't know what to make of it, but they don't think much of it.
The ball's there.
Yeah.
You know? still gonna go about my day. What am I gonna do? Sit here and stare at this ball all day?
Yeah. And he's a little weird because of this. I think it makes him shy. He feels like part of his field of vision.
Got a ball in front of him.
Which is always, it's like a permanent blind spot in the front of his vision as well. And
but he loves the ball.
Yeah, he's into it. The ball doesn't talk to him, but we come to learn later that the ball mysteriously has some form of intelligence because by the end of the novel, we realize that the whole novel is narrated from the perspective of the ball.
Yes, the ball is the narrator.
And the ball has omniscience. Like, it knows what other characters are thinking, even when it isn't present with them, which...
Right, but it also appears to like have the omniscience required to tell this exact story, right? There are very few digressions.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And it also... The ball tells the story retrospectively. And the ball is actually brought back to life at the beginning of the book, far in the future, by an indigenous tribal ritual that has summoned its spirit from the grave, as it were, which is very funny and very strange and very... It puts us in a very weird space as far as... And this is what I mean by like this being a kind of postmodern par excellence novel, right? Where like not only is the narrator non-human, it's a ghost that's been resurrected.
Right. It's a ghost of a non-human entity.
Right. So not only is it non-human,
it doesn't even sugarcoat itself.
Yeah.
It's just like, I'm the ball and I'm telling the story.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no explanation is offered.
I'm called the ball. I'm the ball.
Yeah, it's me, the ball. I'm back.
Yeah, don't personify me. Don't give me a name. I'm the ball.
Yeah. And the ball doesn't communicate directly at any point with anyone in the story. The only thing the ball does for Kazumasa is it gives him this odd detection ability, where he's able, when he's riding the subway one day, he notices the ball like shimmy at a certain point in the tracks, and he alerts the conductor about this, and they go and check, and it turns out...
My ball's shimmying. And
they're like, oh.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to take this seriously for a second.
It turns out he has the ability to detect track defects with a greater degree of precision and before they become truly dangerous. So he gets a job as a track inspector in Japan.
He's sort of beloved because he's saving thousands of lives.
And presumably thousands of dollars because, or yen.
At least at the time.
Yeah. And initially this is great, but it's kind of boring work. he basically just rides around the Tokyo or wherever it is, Kyoto subway, taking various train routes back and forth. And anytime the ball indicates, he alerts the people. They make the
Right.
repair
But
proactively.
eventually, another technology is able to do something similar for much cheaper.
He's automated out of a job, right?
Yeah.
Like they'd rather just have a drone do this work or an
Right.
AI
It's one of the parts I found so funny and great right off the bat is like they get there pretty quick, and just the idea of having this totally fantastical ball have this ability and it gets automated out of a job.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. And so eventually, lacking a career anymore, he decides to follow his cousin, Hiroki, who has already relocated to Brazil.
Mhm.
And Hiroki runs karaoke bars eventually. He's an ancillary character. He's not very important, but he is the reason. He sets up Kazumasa in a nice apartment in Sao Paulo. He gets the same job with the Brazilian.
Right, because their technology is not
Yeah,
advanced
so
enough.
they haven't automated yet because they're still
You're
developing.
like, wait, your ball does what?
Yeah, yeah, and it's not as the system's not as efficient. It's not quite as nice as the Japanese trains. Trains move more slowly, etc. But he's happy because once again he has purpose in his life.
Yeah, he's settling in.
Now, eventually, he starts to play the lotto, and the ball seems to have some kind of ability to predict winning numbers or
Mhm.
something because he plays the lottery enough times and he always wins to
Yeah.
the point where he is very quickly a billionaire. He like wins the lottery, and this is like,
But this happens after the introduction of the other aspect, the pigeons, right?
okay, let's go to that next. So
It's
the other,
it's kind of in that same moment. So we should say
absolutely, absolutely, and that is his neighbors who are
Yeah.
Tanya and Batista Japan. Their name is DJAPAN. They're
Also a hysterical pair.
Oh yeah, and they are Brazilian, but they have Japan in their name. There's a lot of stuff like this where
Yeah.
she's playing around with names, and they are a classic sort of almost a stereotype of like a macho Brazilian man.
Yeah. Like a hot-tempered Brazilian couple, right?
Yeah, and his wife, who's also very attractive, but is always mad at him. They're always fighting. They have a lot of conflicts, but they really love each other. And the conflicts almost feel performative.
Like their
Right.
love language is fighting.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. That's a good way of putting it. And one day they find a pigeon that's hurt, and Batista takes an interest in this. He gets a box for it. He nurses it back to health, and he takes to it. He loves it. He gets really into
Right,
pigeon.
they never have kids.
Yeah, they don't
and
have
so
any. Yeah,
Pigeon starts to replace it. He really gets into the pigeon.
but by the same
Wife's
token,
pissed off.
the wife gets jealous of the
Oh my
pigeon.
God, it's so funny. The wife takes the pigeon, takes to the end of the train line, chucks it away. It's terrible because she's like come down off the high of fighting. She's crying, she's apologizing. The pigeon's upstairs. Pigeons come back.
The pigeon flies right back because,
Yeah.
lo and behold, it is a homing pigeon.
Yeah.
So it returns, and this starts them in a new direction where he starts raising pigeons. He starts inventing new pigeon feed. He starts
Yeah.
marketing. He joins like the Pigeon Fanciers Society.
Right.
He starts
The
routine.
messages, the whole process brings him notoriety.
He starts taking the pigeons out on the weekends and letting them loose further and further away. And he ties a little message to the pigeon's foot. And the messages have a weird kind of gnomic quality. Sometimes they're almost like prophecies.
Yeah.
And at this point, he's noticed Kazumasa living next door. And so he says, one of the messages says something like, the Japanese man with the ball will find happiness and love in Brazil.
And great wealth. or
And
whatever.
great wealth. And this pigeon, and the whole town, all the kids in the neighborhood, when the pigeons come back or outside, they're like, yeah, there it
Yeah.
comes. They're like cheering. It's crazy. And once this message comes, everyone starts being really nice to Kazumasa, which also then triggers him to try his luck at the lottery, which he wins repeatedly to the point where other
Right.
people in Brazil start wearing fake ball like headdresses with like a little rubber ball on that that they've made themselves in order
and then just go gamble like
right.
crazy.
And then the thought being that this will help them to also be very successful.
But let's be clear. Just why don't you paint the picture a bit? When you say he wins, where you're not talking about the odd scratch ticket.
No. He wins like millions and millions of dollars.
Millions into billions of dollars.
Like repeatedly. He just like keeps winning the Mega Millions or whatever the equivalent is. And he eventually sets up a charity where he's going to just give away his money because he's not a greedy guy. He doesn't need this. His friend, his cousin Hiroki, starts investing his money for him on the side. But he sets up this office where people come to borrow money from him or just take money from him. Oh, I need a new wooden leg. I have this amputation. Okay, here's money for that. And then like that guy will come back, will go like get back at the end of the line, right? And be like, and he starts to notice
like, he can't stop giving it away, but it's still like a practice in frustration, right? He's forced to confront how many things, even with unlimited money, are impossible to fix for people. So there's a tinge of sadness and resignation behind the whole thing. But he doesn't stop giving away the money. But he becomes obviously an incredibly important person in the meantime, right?
Right. And this brings us to the next major character who enters the scene at around this time, which is JB Tweep. Now, JB Tweep, T-W-E-E-P. He is a very industrious American who has...
Well, he has 3 arms.
Yeah, he has a third arm, which, like, he wasn't allowed to play baseball as a kid because there are no rules about someone wearing 2 gloves at the same time.
Right. And then he, like, the idea is that he could have been, like, the greatest pianist of all time. But then, of course, no one had, I love this part, it's like, no one had written for 3 arms. So he just gets bored by playing very complicated classical music because it's just not.
It's too easy.
It's still just a 2-hand job ultimately.
Yeah, and we don't know why he has 3 arms. Again, this is just another magical realist element of the story. The 3 arms comes to be a symbol, I think, for American industrial greed, essentially.
Yeah.
That, like, it's not enough for Americans to rob indigenous people or developing nations with 2 arms. They need a third arm to be pickpocketing them as they're taking the money out of their upper pocket. It's just like... he also he has an interesting, he bounces around a lot of careers until eventually landing at this huge company called GGG, which is just a multinational holding company that has no clear purpose. What it does is never really clear, but they have thousands of employees. They have thousands of divisions.
Yeah, it's just the idea that like it's a great device because the business, it's fitting, right? That it's in every space, as they would say, but like it doesn't matter to describe any in particular except when it just leads directly into the plot of this actual story. And you just kind of have access to this like huge research and development wing that he develops, and they're obsessed with like, sort of psychologizing customers and figuring out where the market is and all of that stuff, which then leads into the whole...
Well, they end up finding products that they can create that will fit a niche that they've also created, right? So he's watching TV one day and he sees a video of another one of the major characters, Mane Peña, who's the guy who at the beginning of the story discovered the Matacao. He's an indigenous Brazilian, someone who lives in the jungle, has worked as a poor farmer his whole life, but has also cultivated this sort of new age healing practice involving feathers. And it's kind of like acupuncture. He like pokes people in specific nerve points with feathers, and this allegedly helps them to quit smoking or heal their bad back.
Right. And he's kind of like a wellness guru, Forrest Gump in the history of this, in the sense that like he plays this essential role in the pigeon feather side of things and the Matacao, discovery side.
That's right.
Things.
He's just the accidental guy who's at the site. He sees an interview with him talking about the feathers, and JB Tweep realizes this feather fad can be the big product we push next.
Yeah, this is our break. And the feather it's described so hilariously, like vaguely.
Yeah.
It's just like you kind of wave it in front of your shoulder's fine.
Yeah, or I think it's like you point people, you like sort of.
Right, but it seems to work, right?
Right.
So,
Well, a lot
even
of
though this huge company is trying to figure out a way to exploit it, it does appear to have some sort of magical or pseudo magical properties.
that's right. And essentially, he goes to Brazil to meet with this feather guru, meets with him, starts to use him as a kind of mascot to start this trend, which
Yeah.
is wildly successful. And everyone in New York and Paris are
Like the
soon.
front man. He's like the front man, like the local front man that's being propped up, right, by the big, whether it's an American multinational or, a puppet regime. It's that type of vibe, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And while JB is there setting up this feather business, he also discovers the Madagascar
Yeah.
and realizes, oh my God, there's this other thing here that
Right.
could be even bigger. And he gets a scientist. He literally has a skyscraper imported by helicopters and just dropped into the middle of the jungle. And a whole town springs up along this gigantic black plain.
I mean, it's a pretty direct, sort of metaphor for the way that America and the West was like, wow, there's so many different ways to exploit the rainforest and these natural resources in this area.
Yeah, and this is very directly parallel to Fordlandia. Have you ever heard of Fordlandia? Which is like Henry Ford in the 20s and 30s, as the Model T era is really blowing up, decides, I don't want to rely on these Goodyear freaks for my rubber. I want to be in control of the rubber for my tires as well. So he bought thousands of acres, maybe millions of acres of land in Brazil with the goal of starting a rubber plantation. And he named it Fordlandia. It's almost like corporate Jonestown, because in addition to setting up a rubber operation, he's also going to indoctrinate the locals with American value. He's going to, get them on the American work schedule, convert them to American Protestantism. It's like a whole massive cultural colonial programming operation that completely fails. It doesn't take it. They build this factory town, this whole thing, and for a variety of factors, the environment isn't as good for rubber trees as he thought it would be. There's just all these problems. The people don't want to be, believe it or not, turned into American worker drones. He makes no effort to really understand the culture. He's inflexible. It fails and is abandoned in the middle and is left to rot. This massive facility just decays into the jungle and is forgotten, which comes up in another point in the novel where there's this junkyard in the middle of the jungle that is sort of parallel to what will eventually come in the future. The junkyard in the jungle is also related to the Cold War, wherein the United States during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there's a couple periods in there where a democracy returns for a little while. But for most of that time, it's military juntas backed by the United States. Right. And because they don't want Brazil going the way of Cuba, man, we just can't have that. So, they prop up these petty tyrants, they import all these weapons, and a lot of these weapons get abandoned in the middle, in places, in a manner similar to Fordlandia, right? So it's a sort of waste products of American capital are just left to rot in the jungle. But in the novel, this becomes a sort of seed point for all these animal mutations. We hear of butterflies that like to drink the rust water and so get these really beautiful orange wings from drinking rust. And then these other insects that normally would die from rust develop rust immunities because they eat the butterflies. And then these monkeys find machine guns in the jungle and they start shooting them. And it's a sort of hyper exaggerated Darwinian hyper evolution that occurs as off the back of American waste. And this is an important metaphorical connection to what's going to happen with the Madagascar. The last character to talk about then is Chico Paco, who is a nice boy from the coast whose best friend had a debilitating illness, was in a wheelchair his whole life, and his mother or grandmother prayed and prayed, and one day he was healed. And she'd vowed if he ever got healed, she'd undertake a pilgrimage to the Madagascar as a way of thanking St. George, who is the saint she prayed to. But she's old and infirm. So Chico Paco, good sport that he is, volunteers to do the pilgrimage.
I'll do it for you.
Yeah, and he walks barefoot for thousands of miles into the jungle to the Madakao, where he sets up a shrine that the GGG people don't like. They try to bulldoze the shrine, but the shrine is magnetically attached to the Madakao, so the bulldozer like tips over trying to move it. And this makes him a kind of local hero. He meets Mane Pena, they become friends, and he becomes a kind of evangelical, a Catholic evangelist sort of pilgrim, like saint figure. They refer to him as a saint. He starts a radio show, and taking pilgrimages to the Madakao becomes all the rage. And he has this radio show that's tracking pilgrims and encouraging other people to pray for, he's like a American televangelist in Brazil, but in a kind of Catholic context.
Okay.
So those are the main characters, and they all intersect throughout the novel in a variety of unexpected ways. Essentially what happens is a city springs up in the middle of the jungle based on exploiting first the feathers and then the Madakao substance. The Madakao substance, as I said it before, is used for everything. People have plastic surgery where the Madakao substance is like worked into their cheeks to sculpt higher cheekbones.
Yeah, it's basically, there's no real limit seemingly to the applications this thing can be used for.
And Kazumasa, it turns out, becomes accidentally, because of his cousin's investments, he becomes one of the
cousin's always diversifying his portfolio as he's trying to give away his fortune.
And he just gets richer and richer. He becomes the largest shareholder in GGG. Yeah. So he ends up being like the owner of JB Tweep's operation. So Tweep wants to meet him because he's already in Brazil. And so they meet, and when they do, he notices that the ball is attracted to the Madakao substance. To the point where Kazumasa can't like walk. He's like falling over because it's like a magnetic pull.
And the ball can't help it.
Yeah. And JB Tweep has a light bulb. Oh my God, this ball can find more of this stuff. Because what we eventually learn
can do more than just fix tracks in Brazil and Japan.
Exactly. What we eventually learn is that the Madakao substance is not from aliens. It's not anything that the people had suspected that we discussed before. It is waste from landfills in the first world, so-called the developed world, that has been forced into fissures in the earth and has gone down into like the crust and the mantle and reemerged in these unspoilt areas of the world in this new form. And the Madakao substance is a kind of hybrid artificial and natural substance because of this transformation. It originates as plastic waste, but it goes through this intense geological transformation as it's forced in through the Earth's crust, and it comes out like a new resource, which is brilliant because it's her way of pointing out that even before the direct exploitation of places like Brazil by capitalism, by Cold War, by all these by even Fordlandia, places like Brazil are already being despoiled by waste that arrives there from other parts of the world, right? That we can't really think about locality, the local, in a globalized economy. It doesn't really make sense because even if you go to the depths of the Sahara Desert and you scoop up the sand, you're going to find microplastic waste there, for instance, right? That there's like no escaping the sort of byproducts of mass industrial culture.
Right, and also sort of that although this thing did have all these applications, it is fundamentally waste. And although the appearance of functionality and sort of use can be sort of seen for however long, eventually it will come home to roost because so much damage has been done to the area that even though the area can still be used for, to plunder it, eventually there is no sort of coming back from the original act of spoiling.
That's right. And that even if humankind were to disappear en masse from the globe, right this minute. We've done so much damage. It would take millennia for the Earth to return to a state that existed before the arrival of human beings and industrialization.
So speaking of that, why don't we talk about the return, as it's called, the part five, I believe, the last part of the novel?
Yeah, so one other character to mention is JB Tweet becomes, his whole thing is to be like a shadow boss behind the scenes, but he gradually becomes famous, which he worries will lead to his downfall. And boy, does it. But he has 3 arms. He meets a French ornithologist called Michelle Mabel, which is obviously like me.
And why are they made for each other, Sue? Why are they made for each other? Well,
before that, her name Michelle Mabel, like Michelle Mabel, like her name. She's just a Beatles song made real. But she has 3 breasts. She is a 3-breasted woman for a 3-handed person. Very funny. They get married. They have, wait for it, triplets. He has this whole philosophy that we won't get into, but it's called trialectics. It's not dialectics. It's 3.
So good.
It's very funny.
I just love the idea of citing that there was no point in playing the piano because it's all music for 2 hands, and then he gets the 3-breasted woman. He's like, "This is what I was made for."
yeah, and then of course they have triplets who they name. Yeah. They name the triplets Liberté, Égalité, and Fraternité. Which I think is a fun play on the way the ideals of the French Revolution have, of course, been corrupted by the colonial capitalist drive for world domination, as they even were by Napoleon. Never mind. But there are some problems. So the first is rickettsia, which is a bacteria that lives on feathers and causes a massive typhus outbreak, which just kills millions of people.
90% of people are being killed
in this.
Right? 9 out of 10 people who get it
die in this area, but presumably it spreads beyond because it's on the feathers. The feathers are getting exported. This leads to the total end of the feather fat. Everyone is burning their feathers, even the Madacow feathers, because they started making feathers out of the plastic substance. They're having a problem too, because it turns out if you rub them a lot, they cause a kind of hallucinatory reaction where people believe that they are birds and climb up to tall buildings and attempt to fly and fall to their deaths.
Right. So there's just dead people all over the place who have been using these synthetic feathers, and then they've convinced themselves that they are in fact birds. Right?
Yeah, and it reminds me of that scene with the trampoline in The Simpsons where Homer's like, once you get hurt, move off to the side. And they pull back, and there's just like a field of body. It's like basically that. And this is really bad for business. But then something even worse happens, which is a new bacteria, not the rickettsia, a different one emerges, and it eats the Madacow substance. So this plastic that has been used to construct buildings, to make cars, Chico Paco, for his friend Gilberto, has built an entire amusement park out of it called Chicolandia, which is another Fordlandia reference, right?
Right.
That is devoured by this. Basically, all of the Madacow substance in the world, in a matter of weeks, is destroyed and vanishes.
Right. You basically have this. You have this buildup where once they've reached that point of no return, now you see it unfold first through the typhus, then into the bacteria, then all this stuff starts to spiral. And it impacts the very thing that was supposed to be created to not have to use these other resources, right?
Exactly. And the whole infrastructure collapses. Certain characters die. The feather guru, Manny Pena, he has been alienated from his family by becoming this feather celebrity, but he learns one of his children is sick. He goes back to care for the sick child. The child perishes. Manny Pena himself catches the disease and also dies. Chico Paco, the saint, is caught in a crossfire of industrial spies trying to kidnap Kazumasa. He's shot and killed, and his boyfriend/friend, Gilberto, shoots himself out of a cannon to mark the opening of his amusement park and is burnt to a crisp and floats down in a parachute made of the Madacow substance, burned alive, dies in the exact moment that his friend Chico is shot. JB Tweet Michelle Mabel's like, this is terrible. They try to drop DDT to kill the bacteria, but it ends up just killing all the birds. It kills all the homing pigeons,
a bunch of animals too,
and children, and people. Like, it's a mass, extinction level event in the middle of the jungle. Michelle Mabel is horrified by this. She's like, I came here for my love of birds. I'm leaving. She takes the babies. She gets on a plane back to France. JB Tweep is so...
Yeah, he can't deal with that.
He can't deal with it, so he goes up to the top of his skyscraper.
There'll never be another woman like her.
No, yeah. And he just takes a fatal plunge. He takes himself off the board. So 3 of our main characters die horribly in the final...
Well, it is like, I mean... All of these people, we'll get to Kazumasa obviously at the end here, but all of these people follow this path, right? What's interesting about this is that all of the impacts that end up having such a widespread effect, calamity, right? Catastrophe. There are very few people who are at the wheel, right? Yeah. It's a very tough story. Like we said, there's very few people, and they all some of them have easier upbringings than others. They all get turns of luck that start to lift them up, whether they become famous for the feathers, whether they find the product from an old random video and start to become the head honcho at a huge company. And obviously, Kazumasa making all this money. Everybody in this small circle has this huge influence and has this whole run of pretty good luck, right? The couple who starts to breed the pigeons, everybody. And then, like that, it just all spirals out of control. Not only are they all fucked, but then everybody that they have sort of been able to climb on top of is also just destroyed. And it's all in this very, very comic ending of the novel, right? Where all of this totally nutso stuff is happening. And I just love that as a metaphor that so few people who can control these things can just do so much damage to everybody and everything left in its wake, right?
Absolutely. And so the only people to survive are Tanya and Batista. They've been separated for a few years because Tanya has created an entire pigeon network around the world that's used for advertising. It's a metaphor, I think, for the emergent internet at the time, right? It's like an alternative communication system that corporations are quick to try and capitalize on. Much like as Twitter. Yeah, like Twitter, much as the internet would be, and starting in the 90s, and obviously here we are today with X.com, the everything site, and such. This drives them apart, and Batista is very upset. He's still growing his pigeons. All of his pigeons die because of the DDT. And at the very end of the novel, the Madakao is gone. There's just a big pit where it used to be. There's all these now empty businesses around it, but there's no, everyone's either dead or is left. But he finds Tania, she returns, and they reunite. They've lost everything, but they still have each other. Kazumasa escapes. JB Tweep has been using him to find this substance all over the world. He escapes from that after this assassination attempt goes wrong, and JB dies. The ball itself, our narrator, is devoured by the bacteria. And for the first time in his life, he can see clearly. His view is unobstructed. And he realizes that Lourdes, this character,
his former maid,
who's in love with him. He finally realizes this. She has kids. They get married. He still has tons of money. So they buy a farm, and they sort of end up living this pastoral, Edenic existence where he has a ready-made Brazilian family, and he's fully integrated into his new culture and society. So he has a happy ending, but everyone else is either destitute, dead, or
I mean, because all he was trying to do was help people out. All the evil stuff he was involved with, it was always made that it was unwitting, right?
Yeah, he was
in charge of GGG.
Yeah, exactly. He's been a pawn in other people's schemes, but he's never been an agent of any of this harm. And Chico Paco. So the novel ends, and you're like, wow, that was crazy. But one of the last scenes is Chico Paco's the followers. They mount a funeral procession to carry him from where the Madakao was back to his coastal village. And they tramp through the jungle, and there's this depiction of them just destroying the jungle as they go, and as they're walking, there are all these new exploitative operations that are springing up, and it's the message is clearly all right, so this one very fantastical, highly destructive example of exploitation of the environment is over, but there are already new and even, more exploitative operations springing up in its place, as though this is a process that will not end until human society as we know it has been destroyed. Sometime far in the future, the indigenous people who have survived all of this are the only ones left. They're in the shadow of the like hulking former, now overgrown, the ruins of the city that are now overgrown with vines, and they summon up the ball, which tells us this story, and it says that it's now become a memory, and it's like, but whose memory? Is it for you? Is it for me? And that's how the novel ends. Yeah. And I just think it's like such a brilliant book, and it has a lot of messages, but it's not didactic. It doesn't tell you what to think. No,
it sounds more heavy-handed in our description than it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's very light, it's very and it's very funny. It's like,
and it's very visual, right? Like the way that she paints these moments. When I was reading it, I like within the first like 30 pages, I started looking up. I was like, surely someone has made this into a movie or a TV show. Like, this is crazy. I can't believe. And then there's like, from what I can see, there's nothing.
Yeah.
At least, I mean, maybe there's something in Japan or Brazil. I don't know, but like, it would make an incredible movie or show, I think.
I agree. I mean, it's really funny. It's really smart. And it's not that well known. I mean, there's critical work that's been done about it. I mean, it's well known in academic circles. And, it's still in print. It's around. She has other novels I think are maybe slightly more famous, but I think it should be better known. I think it's a great book. And, I'm really glad we had the chance to talk about it, because I think it touches on a lot of the themes that we've been talking about throughout the show. And like the main message is what I said before, I think, which is that like, the earth can heal. Like, if we can stop the madness, the earth can heal. But even in its healing, it's already been forever changed. And that's bad and good.
I think it's also a bit about this feeling of we are in this sort of primarily reactive position, it feels, where we are consistently creating solutions that then create problems.
Yes.
Right. So like, how do we communicate more effectively? ... Twitter ... X ... disaster. Like, then we have to fix it. Like, I mean, how do we get around quicker? Uber. Oops. Like, fuck.
Lyft. Oh no, not good either.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's sort of part of it.
Uber Green. Remember our Uber Green?
You're already sort of exploiting these areas for all of these different reasons. And then you find this, lo and behold, these feathers that do this weird shit. Oh my God, what else? This substance?
Yeah.
Everything's going to work out just fine, and it kind of feels very similar to where we actually are.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to stop.
Yes. Well, speaking of exploitative endeavors, we will be covering the presidential debate,
as we said, and that should be a total nightmare. Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to it, nevertheless. And this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and we'll talk to you real soon.